Um, so let me just get right into it. So our basic approach in this was to first just think through, and where we are right now is that we submitted our chapter draft, and we've gotten 3 reviews back from Patrick Heller at Brown, from Arun Joshi at the IDS, and from Punch, all 3 very, very useful. And we should have the final version of the chapter into you guys by Friday. So it's almost ready, just to get it. So one of the things that we took in is to start to begin and say that the idea of housing that we take is to not focus on the built unit of a house, but to think of housing actually as a much more broad and interesting phenomenon. So the report actually opens with quoting 4 types of definitions. The definition of housing by the Reserve Bank of India, by the National Habitat Policy, by UN Habitat, and by the National Housing Bank, each of which privileges a very different aspect of housing depending on their interests. The RBI sees it as an employment multiplier. The National Housing Bank sees it as an access to credit and an opening up of nationalization of markets. The UN Habitat Policy sees it as roti kapra or makan, and that very much as a basic shelter. And I think it's actually for housing, this tension between something that is a growth sector for city managers, that is a public good, that is not in India a constitutional right, something we lay out quite clearly. In fact, one of the other interesting things we're doing right now is telling the history of something called the National Campaign for Housing Rights that was started and ran to the late 80s, that almost got a right to housing into the Constitution but failed. And I think that our take and establishing that set, and I'm drawing here from a long history of writing on housing that says housing is not just a noun, housing is also a verb, to think about the various roles that housing plays. So laying that out, one of the complementary takes we take on something that Harsh said is not that we see it, the role of housing as a public good, not just as something that is then enshrined as a legal or moral entitlement, though we very much make that case. And we're very transparent about the ethical, and this is something we discussed in the meeting last time. We make the ethical location of the chapter quite clear in the forefront. And I think that this is not the debate about how much you should do this and whether it turns off or doesn't to the reader. But I think in something like housing, that is, people come at it from such different norms and ethical positions, it's an important thing to do. And I think that, our discussion in the last meeting about being upfront about that is the way that we've gone in this chapter. We make a second argument that housing is a good, is one that requires public interventions, because in the absence of those public interventions, there will be a range of exclusions that we believe are unacceptable. So I think that this is another way to flip around the public good argument, is to actually see goods that we argue require, because there is a big debate, especially now, in housing circles on what role the private sector has and the market has in supplying low-income housing to for this environment. Which is why I think it is, again, a very important stand the chapter takes, is that we don't believe that market without public intervention. Now the question is, what is this intervention? It can, now, do we mean old school DDA style, we will build low-income housing? Do we mean public policy? Do we mean legal regulation? Do we mean intervention? And I think that's the range of it that we discussed in the chapter. And I think that this is one thing that could be, again, a common thematic across the various issues, about thinking about the nature of public intervention and making a case that without public intervention, significant exclusion will result, even as people will take multiple routes in one day out. So we divided the chapter into 2 parts: A, what housing is, and B, what housing does. And the reason we did that is that we think the nature of exclusion in housing actually follows these 2 patterns. There is the absolute fact of an empirical exclusion in housing itself. I do or do not have a house. I do or do not have shelter of adequate quality. But there are then a set of connected exclusions, that the absence of that access to adequate housing then leads to a series of connected exclusions, say in health or in education or in other words. And so we split the chapter heading of what is the nature of exclusion here into both how we understand exclusion and access, but also then to think about what that exclusion does. And I can show you what we did on various times. And the classic example here is Bombay, where under the slum rehabilitation schemes in the last 10 years, 60,000 new housing units have been built. but the percentage of Bombay living in slums is not reduced even by 1%, even though migration rates have fallen. And I think this is the really interesting challenge, that you're building this vast new built environment of housing stock, but you're not making a dent on the housing shortage. And that's partly telling us that those units are not going where they should, but it's also telling us that building large amounts of new housing stock for redevelopment cannot be the basis of housing policy. The third thing that we add, and I think this is where sort of IXR in our position on housing shortage comes up, is that we include a third category that the Pundu Committee report doesn't. And I should mention that the Pundu Committee report is the first big public data that includes homelessness explicitly as a category in measuring housing shortage, is the question of illegality. And we've done a lot of work on this, and I'm borrowing from my own work. But we're arguing essentially that one of the conditions for housing policy has to be insecurity of tenure. That if you live in insecure tenure, of whatever range of absolute insecurity in terms of being what in Delhi would be called a JJ cluster, and so you're someone who is neither, you make no claim to legality or ownership, and you can make no claim to legality or ownership in title, and are therefore then both threatened by and experience cycles of urban displacement, eviction and resettlement, then that condition of insecurity of tenure maps both what housing is and what housing does. So therefore, our understanding of exclusion follows these three frames: homelessness, housing poverty, and illegality. And we trace each of these and what it does to exclusion, and produce the empirics of each of these in our first section of what housing is. Okay. So the structure of the chapter begins with empirics, and what we do is, on those three lines, homelessness, housing poverty, and illegality, we present the figures of the Pundu Committee report. We then use an additional set of data from the house listing table of the census 2011. And what this allows us to do is to break down housing shortage of various kinds, all the three dimensions, by gender, by caste, and by gender and caste together. So you're able to look at what the house listing tables allow you to do: access to amenities, access to environmental services, access to infrastructure, material of house, material of room, and they allow you to break them by scheduled caste, by scheduled tribe, by gender, and then also by gender and scheduled caste together, by gender and scheduled tribe together. So you get a series of very interesting tables that are able to show you what we know most about empirics here, and I think this is what then links into the statistical appendix. We then use a series of secondary smaller findings with a particular focus on the impact of eviction and resettlement, which doesn't get captured by a lot of these statistics. And then introduce secondary level literature that looks at studies on the illegality of tenure, trying to figure out what we know about how widespread the different forms of illegality of tenure are. And here I think one of the things that again should be a subject of debate for us on the chapter and on the report's framing is that illegality in terms of settlement in Indian cities is not limited to the poor. Right? So the notion of illegal occupation ranges from sending farms down to Sanjay Camp. And the question of, and those consequences also of illegality, and the policies of course of regularization of unauthorized colony in one end versus upgradation of buses in the other end lead to a very interesting tension that what happens in urban is that the consequences of different forms of illegality are very different for different strata of citizens. There's no other way to say it, because it really is a question of strata of citizens in these ways. So now there are exclusions thus that fall upon non-poor and non-elite actors in terms of housing. In this chapter, we have not addressed those exclusions. And this is something that we should debate as a collective thinking about it, is to what extent do we include a certain set of exclusions that do not have the same consequences because they don't fall upon they fall upon actors that in other realms can bear those exclusions very differently. So the impact of discrimination is very different. That does not make it any less discriminatory. Particularly, I'll throw up one of the challenges for us is what do you do, for example, with identity-based discrimination faced by elite actors? So what do you do when Shabana Azmi says, I can't get a house in Bombay because I'm Muslim? And wanting to take very seriously discrimination in housing practice by religion, but recognizing also that the overlap of identities means the consequences of some exclusion are very, very different. And so I'll throw that up there, and I don't have now. And then we looked at something we called housing in citizenship. And this we felt was very important because one of the things that we wanted to talk about, and this goes back to our questions of exclusion, that how much does income poverty determine quality of life? Part of it really depends on questions of how legitimate your claims are seen to be. Right? So not just what is the current entitlement framework. So we're looking at what is the nature of claims that we make to a certain set of rights and entitlements. And what this section is taking on is how seriously are those claims taken? What is the political power behind the voice of claims? And what we're saying is, one of the things that housing poverty, illegality, and homelessness does is that it reduces your standing as a claimant who is seen as a legitimate bearer of rights. Now in homelessness you see this quite clearly, where you can be the object of charity, but you cannot be the bearer of rights. In housing poverty, you see this as an equivalent of the criminalization of the urban poor, discursively, media. So the question really becomes, so a lot of my earlier work used to look at court cases on eviction and resettlement. And one of the arguments that we always made there is, when you stand up in court, one of the ways in which evictions happen, say in Delhi, with to such intensity over 20 years, is you had courts saying, if you're an encroacher on public land, you have no business claiming rights or claiming resettlement. Right? So one of the famous cases, the court said, giving resettlement to an evicted slum dweller is like rewarding a pickpocket for stealing. This is the Supreme Court judgment. And that line got quoted repeatedly in different places. So what one of the arguments we're really making here is, it's not just important to see the material exclusion, but to really see that your standing as a citizen, the evaluation in which the media, the court, the government judge your right to have rights, right, is very much linked to your perception, your legitimacy, your acceptance as someone who should be included. So looking at what exclusion to access does to citizenship, I think is something that, and this comes from the danger here, of course, is you don't want to fall back into a cultures of poverty, bad 60s, 1960s sociology kind of argument, which one keeps skirting here. So the argument here is to not, is to very much, and in this section we very much charted both the resistance as well as the danger of those kinds of things. Okay. So what housing is, what housing does, is very much in the CES report scheme are the nature of exclusion section. So from there we go on to the causes of exclusion. And this again is, this is what a question I asked in the last meeting is, how in the world do you write a section called the causes of exclusion for where we are? Right? This is so we've taken, now, so the way this and the next section are framed is we basically try and highlight 5 kind of meso level arguments that we take and sort of just mark them down. So what we've taken in our first cause that we've argued is the absence of rights and entitlements. Right? Now this is one of the questions here is, and here the argument that we're running is, look, you don't have a constitutional right, and you have very uncertain judicial legacies on what the derived right to housing is. So if one side of, you can get up and say, but the court has said that 21 equals value, and you will give me Olga Tellis, Chamil Shantisar Builders, Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, and a series of judicial precedents that the housing is derived right. The other side will give you Okhla, Pikampura, Wazirpur, and a set of completely contrary judgments to the Supreme Court. So the basic thing is that when you go to court, say under the PIL, and saying that, look, are there not rights to housing? On Tuesday there is, and on Wednesday there isn't. And that means that the judiciary is a very uncertain ally at best in the protection of housing. This makes it very, very different for us typically from, now there is a set of other emergent policy articulations, for example like the Rajiv Awas Yojana, that has a statement about, very explicit rights-based statement about access and shelter. The problem again is policies and acts and laws are very different orders of legitimacy for rights. So we've talked about the absence of legal rights and entitlements. We made an argument that while we don't believe that having a right to housing is a magic wand that solves housing exclusion, we very much believe it is a part of what allows certain exclusions to persist and reproduce themselves. So the last section we thought about is moving forward, and here again, the way we, so we're just following sort of Harsh's, the argument that was given, right? So talking about nature of the exclusion, cause of the exclusion, and then the ways, thinking about the way forward. So again, we took approaches as opposed to specifics. Now there is something to be said here about translating these into very specific briefs, where you can, I can imagine taking up a small addendum 2-pager that actually gives medium-term concrete policy action. So if that's an outcome that we want to do at some point, or an annex we can put together at some point, which addresses specific things you want to happen to the JNUR and then the Rajiv Awad Yojana and various kinds of policy paradigms. This is not at that scale. This is at a broader scale of thinking about. So we make 5 approaches. One is we argue that there needs to be an agreement on an entitlement framework that does not necessarily need to look like a right to housing, but could actually take several steps on the way. We think about expanding that notion of housing, making an agreement on legality, and some of the places where this is beginning to happen, the RUI stands for the Rajiv Awad Yojana, which is the big flagship ministry scheme. Now again, what will happen on June 1st, 2014, the Rajiv Awad Yojana, I don't know. I'm hoping it will I'm hoping that only the Rajiv will change and the Awas and the Yojana will stay, but we have no idea where it's going to go. The second, and I think which is a much more hopeful place for me, is that 6 states in India have now adopted something they call an affordable housing policy. And the affordable housing policy is Rajasthan led with this in 2009. Karnataka has notified its policy 3 weeks ago. Odisha, Andhra Pradesh are both very close to doing it. And the affordable housing policy is a very interesting animal. It's not a slum redevelopment policy. It's not neither is it a. It's sort of it's trying to be lots of things. So it's trying to find a way to bring the private sector into low-income housing, for better or for worse. It's trying to do a certain set of large-scale planning interventions on land reservations and FSI. It's playing some of the tradable transfer development rights, FSI, FAR game a little bit. But it is going to be a very interesting space because it's a state-level policy that a lot of states are putting their money behind. So Rajasthan actually has succeeded in building over 60,000 units of housing at 3.5 lakhs per unit, which is cheaper than the Rajiv Awad Yojana's subsidized housing program. So it really could be a very interesting argument. It doesn't take the rights-based approach. So again, it's going to be an interesting site which could work us backwards to generating this agreement on housing. The second for us is a very clear sense of prioritizing in situ upgradation. And I talked a little bit about the distinction between upgradation and redevelopment here. And we go into it in the report quite clearly. What we're basically saying is when you look at, and there's a lot of good data now where government has begun to take this seriously. What we're seeing across the country is housing units that are built under the basic services for urban poor, the JNURM program, their occupancies are at 30%. Right? So essentially what you're saying is you're building these new housing and they look like new housing, you're very proud, and there's all these photos of completed units that housing boards across the state will show you, and they're all always empty. And you keep asking people, what's the huge challenge? And I work closely with municipal housing boards in many of the southern states. And what they're saying is what we don't understand is why is the occupancy so low, right? And again, the challenge one is facing here is what we're reading wrong is that the question is not the quality of shelter, the question is the location, the possibility of livelihood, right? So what you're basically seeing is units that are built away from work, which are where most of these units are being built, are seeing abandonment and occupancy rates of no more than 30 to 50%. So one of the big pushes that we're saying is housing policy has to be evaluated not by number of units built, but by actual occupancy at the end of 2 years. And this is something we're trying to put into the actual evaluation that Rajiv Awad Yojana and other kind of places. So the question is, how do you prioritize in situ upgradation both in the policy's own terms as well as in its practice? And we're thinking about where, and we go through a series of suggestions on how to do this. We argue that the focus of housing policy should not be a narrow understanding of property right understood as individual household title, but actually should focus on a number of different ways in which security of tenure can be provided. And understand that titling is only one form of that tenure. So this draws actually from an argument that our challenge for housing policy is to ensure that there is access to affordable housing stock at multiple levels, which means sometimes focusing not that the same household lives in that same flat given to them under a policy scheme, but that households of a particular economic type. Now, I'm saying this also because one of our big challenges in housing policy historically has also been to say that when you're given the example of a plot in Bhavana after eviction, you are an eternal owner-occupier of that plot. Right? You're not allowed to transfer it, rent it, sell it, because the argument is, I have given this to you as a subsidy. Therefore, it is now it becomes an albatross around your neck. Now, neither is this plot designed in a way that it can expand. And here you go right back to congestion and produced housing poverty. Because what you're basically saying is, I give this plot to you at 30, and when you marry and your family expands and you have children, that same housing unit, which has no way to expand and grow because we never thought about it incrementally, actually then becomes inadequate. But you aren't allowed to move out of it or sell it or rent it or transform it in a certain way. And actually you end up thinking in terms of a certain housing trap. So one of the ways we're saying is, can we think about ways to both bring back an incremental nature of housing, but also to think about what is it that makes people tenure secure. So the example that we draw in the chapter is from borrowing from the upgradation scheme in Thailand called Ban Mangkong. And Ban Mangkong actually is the inspiration for the Rajiv Awaz Yojana, except that they copy-pasted a lot of the good parts and left out some of the key safeguards that prevented it from becoming what it is. But one of the things that they argue there is that community long-term tenure that draws upon the cooperative model has the ability to give secure tenure but also prevent immediate gentrification of housing units. And so therefore you see a quick rise, right? And Bombay is the classic example of this. If you go to a slum rehab authority 9th floor building, a large chunk of the units are actually architectural studios. It's a perfect size for a one-person architectural studio. And our ability to monitor illegal sale and transfer is near zero. So the question is, what are the ways in which you can think about keeping housing stock affordable at a certain level, preventing unit modification? And one of the suggestions we are saying is thinking about community monitored long-term leaseholds are a very different way in to both prevent gentrification but not make households. The other one is an approach that we've been writing about in other ways, where we're talking about what do you do about the fact that housing illegality seems to be a barrier in access to other social services like health and education. So if you want to move to a universal social security regime, so there's lots of talk, right? There's a national urban livelihoods mission that is meant to be the urban equivalent to Narega. There is the national urban health mission that Harsh has been part of and advising. We have the right to education. We have an expanded right to food. But one of the big questions is, as these entitlements for urban residents come up, our big question is, who is an urban resident? What Narega doesn't quite fight with that hard, though it does in its own way. Are you going to count someone who lives in a basti as an urban resident? So for urban social security to truly be universal, illegality of residence, I've been arguing in some of my other work elsewhere, is going to be one of your most significant barriers. And how will you prove residence in order to access these new systems of urban social security? We have currently what is required for urban residents is to fall back on proving that I have lived in this place for a certain number of years. Because if you have not, so for example, to get a resettlement plot post an eviction, you have to show that you have been in the city before what is called a cutoff date. Now that cutoff date varies. In Delhi, it's actually as late as 2007 or 2009, depending on who you are. In Bombay, for a long time, it was 1195, right? Which actually means that if you came to the city in 1996, even if you've been here for 20 years, you have no entitlement. Now, you also have to prove that you have been here since 1195, which means you have to have some form of identification that has that date and that address on it. Now, this is nearly impossible. In the context of large-scale evictions and repeated evictions, it's particularly impossible, right? Because it means you never have ID from a continuous address if you've been moved 4 times within the city in your children. So our argument here is that we must shift the definition of urban residence not as a proof of residence, but as a proof of what we call the intent to reside. Okay? So the intent to reside is, we've argued this in detail elsewhere, but we've used a series of Supreme Court judgments on the definition of residence. One as old as 1963, one as recent as 2013, arguing that if there is what the court calls animus merendi, an evidence of the intention to reside, that should be enough for you to be called an urban resident and access services. So we outlined this in detail, saying this is the legal defense of the intent to reside, this is the constitutional defense, and this is the operational policy paradigm of it. So we suggest the kind of IDs that could be used, the kind of numbers could be used. It's a proposition, it's a new one, but I think actually it could have a lot of purchase if we pursued it further, especially the context. The last thing that no, that is something else. Right, that's it. Awesome. So that's a good thing.
I would like to state here that, as the name suggests, this chapter is limited, the scope of this chapter is limited to urban housing. We do not really touch upon rural housing. Housing is many things to many people. The National Habitat Policy sees housing and shelter as a basic human need, while the UN recognizes it as a human right. Both these definitions implicitly see exclusions from housing as ethically and often legally unacceptable. Other discourses in the sector see housing as a commodity to be bought and sold in the market. In their own different ways, these different definitions of housing see it as an asset, an end in itself. While housing is not just what it is, but what it does. Reserve Bank of India spoke about employment generation potential of affordable housing sector. Similarly, for the National Housing Bank, housing is a basic need, but also a valuable collateral that can enable the access to credit from the financial market. Others argue that housing is a vector to other development capabilities. Without it, health, education, psychosocial development, cultural assimilation, belonging, and economic development are impossible. Therefore, housing is not just a physical unit, but an agglomeration of what all it does.
And the Exclusion Report, a very nice little piece. I think what you just said, Harsh, is I think a critical feature of this particular approach, because in some senses, at one level, what this chapter advocates is not so much for the state to do something as for the state to not do something. Right? The state currently is in this process of actively relocating, engaging, essentially saying that we're going to give you better housing. So under the GNNURM, they sanctioned about 1.5 million houses, of which they've built about half of that, 750,000 or so, but only about 400,000 of them are actually occupied. Because it's the places where the houses are built, the facilities that the houses have, make them extremely unlivable, and therefore difficult to engage. So one of the, I think the primary contribution of this chapter is that exclusion by the state refers as much to state action, and where the state action is exclusionary, if the state ceases to act, that might actually produce better outcomes than what it is currently doing. That's one issue that I would like to flag in this one. And the reason for this is actually, in some sense, interesting, because, and here I'll sort of structure this. As Harsh said, a lot of these, and Deepika pointed out, the issue here, when we look at the Kundu Committee report and so on, is not so much about actually not having a house, but essentially living in quote-unquote congested housing. Most of those, 97%, large proportion of them essentially. So what is the response to that? The response to that is increase the space that you're living in, and you see in urban housing. And the services is the next part of the story, which where actually so that's something that is incremental and people are getting into the story. But a person can build a house, but it's very difficult for that person to bring water, bring transport services, bring sewerage, or whatever else way you want to treat that septic. All those things are difficult for individuals to accomplish. And that's where, in as much as the state has to refrain from going ahead and trying to provide everybody with cement blocks at the periphery of cities and recognize the places where they're currently staying, the next issue is you need to then provide them. This is where the state has to make positive action. So there is one where it has to refrain, and the one where it has to act. And in making that particular engagement, the state often refrains from doing so. And largely, and this is where I find that the chapter could perhaps have dealt with these issues a little more strongly, which is the extent to which issues of land, the valuation of land, and the struggles and contestations around land, especially in prime urban areas, make the state reluctant to invest and recognize the rights of people who are currently occupying it, because there are other people who essentially have eyes on that particular land. Right? So that's the basic political economic tension that prevents, otherwise what would have been a relatively simple problem, let people stay where they are and we'll just sort of over time give them water, sewage, sanitation problems. So that's how I see the core thrust of this particular report. The other issue that I found interesting going forward as they move across these reports, talking about engagements with various services, is how, if you were to engage with these kinds of services, one of the primary findings in many of these studies, for example, is, and we were speaking about the education of the girl child earlier, is that if you are looking to engage in providing water for your household, and the responsibility of that is for the slightly older girl child, then that responsibility then interferes with the kind of schooling that that person can actually accomplish. More importantly, as one of the cases here documented in the study finds out, when you relocate people from one locality to the other, you also disturb the variety of other social infrastructures, including health and education, that came with that particular initial location. So it's then that in some sense, even the theoretical idea of improving the condition of your house actually makes the condition of your housing, which includes all the other services, much worse. So in trying to improve one component of that housing basket, it essentially ended up in reducing the quantities of the other components. And it is these trade-offs that I think the chapter brings out relatively well, and therefore, in some senses, actually offers a fairly feasible way for the state to move forward in remedying some of the exclusions that it offers.
Okay, thank you. This is the